Has the peace process in Afghanistan collapsed? In a tweet, the US president calls off talks with Taliban leaders. Did Donald Trump take Twitter diplomacy too far? Or are there deeper reasons behind the decision? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I am Hashem Ahelbarra. Talks to end the war in Afghanistan appear to be making progress. The Taliban and the US came up with a draft deal after nearly a year of discussions in Qatar. And America's chief negotiator sounded optimistic when he revealed the details to the Afghan president last week. But now a breakdown. In a tweet, the US president cancelled a secret meeting with Taliban leaders and the Afghan president at Camp David. Donald Trump blamed a Taliban car bombing that killed an American soldier and 11 other people in Kabul on Thursday. He doubted the armed group wanted to negotiate a meaningful agreement, but the Taliban warned the US that Americans will suffer more than anyone else for cancelling the talks. Tony Bertley is in Kabul for us.
Privately, I think the Afghan government is pleased that these talks have been cancelled, but officially they are thanking the Americans for their efforts in these peace negotiations, and they've stressed that the only way to getting a meaningful peace in Afghanistan is through non-violence. They want the Taliban to stop fighting, they want a ceasefire, something that has never been agreed between the Americans and the Taliban, and they want to hold direct talks with the Taliban. This is something the Taliban has always refused. They call the Afghan government a puppet of the Americans, and they refuse to talk to them. Of course, with this draft peace agreement, if it was signed, it would then lead to direct talks in some form with the Afghan government. But there are concerns. Now, the Afghan government wants an end to the fighting. It wants then meaningful talks to go ahead. And the big question is, where does this now leave us? The Taliban, we understand, are having high-level meetings of their own. They can go two ways. They can either say, yes, hang on, the Americans are serious, let's go back to the negotiating table with something more to offer, because so far they've conceded very little, or it can lead to an escalation of the conflict. Everyone here has been concerned at the pace of these peace negotiations. They've had 9 meetings in a year, quite an achievement getting them around the table in the first place, but the Americans have been accepting too little from the Taliban. That's the overriding opinion. So they want more from the Taliban before we will get a meaningful peace. But there is still here now an edge to this city. People are concerned that the attacks which have increased in the recent days and weeks may increase even further.
It's unclear whether the US-Taliban talks are permanently over or just postponed. But here's a look at how they began. The armed group repeatedly refused to hold direct negotiations with the Afghan government. It views Ashraf Ghani's administration as illegitimate. Taliban leaders insisted on negotiating with the US instead, and those talks began in Qatar last October. After 9 rounds of meetings, the two sides struck a draft peace deal that could lead to the withdrawal of 5,000 US troops. In return, the Taliban must guarantee it won't use Afghanistan as a base for attacks on other countries. Let's bring in our guests. Mushtaq Rahim is a founding member of the Afghan think tank Afghanistan Affairs Unit and worked on the Afghan peace process. In London, Hamid Hakimi, research associate at Chatham House and former international policy advisor to the Afghan Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And in Alexandria, Virginia, in the US, Johnny Walsh, senior expert on Afghanistan at the United States Institute of Peace. Welcome to you all. Mushtaq, how significant was that tweet about Trump, who was willing to meet with Mullah Brother and with Ashraf Ghani at Camp David?
A significant event, because apparently everything was seemingly sorted out between the Taliban and Zalmay Khalilzad. When he came to Kabul, he even showed a copy of the peace agreement that was about to be signed between the two sides. And then President Ghani was all prepared to fly out to the United States. So the series of the tweets that came last night, I think it has put absolute heart, at least for the time being, to the ongoing peace process. And there has been a significant level of mistrust now created between the Taliban and the Americans, which was garnered and generated by Zalmay Khalilzad over the course of last 12 months in 9 rounds of peace negotiations with the Taliban.
Hakimi, I mean, we knew that the Taliban and the Americans were about to finalize a breakthrough deal. But I mean, to see Trump shaking hands with Mullah Brother, talking to Ashraf Ghani, and then announcing that deal, this must have been a bombshell revelation that could send shockwaves across the political establishment in Afghanistan.
Absolutely, the optics would have been entirely something out of a movie, you could say. But yeah, absolutely, there is significantly, significant elements within Afghanistan who disagree with the way the talks with the Taliban are going. Not necessarily with the fact that there is a process of negotiations with the Taliban, but the fact that the Taliban have remained consistent in their messaging that this is a negotiation to end what they call the foreign occupation. So they have been on message, whereas the party that they're speaking to, i.e. the United States, seems to have come round to the idea of talking to the Taliban. So the optics have always played in the last sort of 11 months, 12 months, in the favor of the Taliban per se, especially to their constituency. And absolutely, having a summit in Camp David, which is a venue reserved for world leaders, for globally significant events, this would have legitimized the Taliban, I think, also to the extent that some people in Afghanistan, particularly the political elite who don't like the Taliban, would have not liked to see.
Johnny, is this an official American recognition of the Taliban as the ones who call the final shots in Afghanistan, and therefore the Americans recognize the need to do business with them from now onwards?
No, I think there's absolutely not an official recognition of the Taliban by any means, and I don't think anyone within the US government would support that. I think there is a strong belief that the only positive outcome to this war in Afghanistan is a peace process, and that the way to get one started is an agreement with the Taliban that involves drawing down troops conditionally. And over the last year, there's been an enormous amount of effort put into that with broadly support across the American government. That's crucial. This obviously is a major moment, probably setback to the effort. But regardless of where it goes and who is willing to talk to the Taliban, I don't perceive any sense that they recognize the Taliban as a legitimate government or anything else. That's how they view the Afghan government.
Mushtaq, what's next? Do you think that this is something that is going to be permanently postponed, or do you see the potential for the Americans and the Taliban to sit together and negotiate a way out?
Well, frankly speaking, all sides engaged in the Afghan conflict have been facing the brunt of the ongoing conflict, which is faced with an absolute stalemate since 2014. And that was the sole reason that all parties, regardless of their position, were prepared to engage in negotiation process. I don't see this series of tweets derailing the whole process or putting a full stop to it. Definitely, there is mistrust created between the two sides, and the Taliban have lost a bit of ground in regard to trusting the American government, as they also said that this in their statement that came out today. But definitely, I'm seeing that they're going back to the negotiation table, but it's going to be another gruesome and a long way before they can reach an agreement, because trust is of an essence in any peace process. And I think that was built by Zalmay Khalilzad after meticulous engagement with the Taliban in 9 rounds of negotiations. In the meantime, he had conceded the Afghan government as far as the Taliban were concerned in the peace process. And he went to the extent where he did not even hand over the copy of the peace agreement, and rather merely showed it to the Afghan president. We saw that there were statements from the Afghan National Security Advisor in the United States during the course of these 9 rounds, where he said that they don't trust Zalmay Khalilzad, and he was termed
which is obvious. I mean, we know why they are upset, because they have been completely sidelined during the 9 months of negotiations. Hamid, let's talk a little bit about that draft agreement. When you look at the content, it gives you the impression that the Americans, in exchange for a sense of guarantee of security and stability in Afghanistan from the Taliban, they were willing to give them an absolutely huge political sway in the country.
I mean, depends how you look at the draft and who you are when you look at the draft. But certainly, from any angle that you look at that particular document, it can look as a document that's been put together to give the Taliban the legitimacy that they've always wanted. They have always argued since early 2000s, when they started to fight against the US presence in Afghanistan, that they wanted a negotiation directly with the United States, that they did not recognize the Afghan government as a legitimate entity, that it was one that was put in place by the United States. So the draft agreement, there were tacit sort of confirmations of those assumptions that the Taliban have had and have been promoting to their constituency for all these years. And this is why exactly there was such a huge amount of reservation within certain Afghan political elite circles, not least within the Afghan government itself under President Ghani, that they did not like the document. They did immediately explain that they had reservations about certain elements of it. And I think also for the broader public, we should not forget that Afghanistan has been urbanized since 2001. To a greater extent, there's a huge number of people that live in the cities, and that cities have been broadly facing the brunt of the Taliban attacks, where in the rural areas, the Taliban have been attacked consistently by the NATO-led, and then the last few years by the Afghan security services. So in the cities, the perception of a peace deal with the Taliban and how it's received is entirely different to how it might be viewed and perceived in the rural areas. Although Afghans, as a total, they do want an end to violence. But I think that particular draft looked like it was giving the Taliban an upper hand, and the Taliban could actually sell it as a product that shows that they have actually succeeded, that they've beaten the world's heaviest superpower, and all those kinds of things that you can create narratives in your favor from.
Johnny, some American diplomats cautioned against the deal, particularly when it comes to the withdrawal prior to any comprehensive settlement with the Taliban, saying that it could be catastrophic, leading to further anarchy in Afghanistan. Isn't this a realization that at least from those experts, that the Americans are giving too much to the Taliban in exchange for a permanent deal?
Well, I think the most important part about the deal as it's been structured has often been missed in the public discussion. And there's a perception that in this deal, the US troops would leave no matter what the Taliban does. And that's perhaps what some Taliban hope is true, and it's certainly what many in Afghanistan fear is true. I really don't think it is true, though. And Khalilzad has been fairly clear many times. His phrase is, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And the concept is that this deal lays out a conditional drawdown, a potential drawdown, and the timetable on which it would happen. But there's a huge difference between agreeing on that timetable and actually removing the troops. And so I would strongly agree with those diplomats who wrote the letter you're referring to, that the actual departure of US troops needs to be pinned to milestones in the peace process. Because what's important is to actually get to a ceasefire and a political settlement that brings peace to the country. Without that, a drawdown could be a disaster. But I really think this deal has been mischaracterized as leaving regardless of what happened.
Well, anyway, we do understand, Mushtaq, that parts of the provisions in the deal are kept secret for the time being because it's not set into stone. But however, let's try and read into possibilities and scenarios. Once there is a deal, what becomes of the Taliban? What kind of role do you think they will accept to play in the Afghanistan in the future if it is not the lead role in the country?
Well, there has been a hide-and-seek sort of game between the Taliban and the Americans. None of them have been coming clear in terms of their position. I can remind you, some of the Taliban leaders previously, after the rounds of talks, talked about dissolving the Afghan army, overhauling the whole, doing the constitution. But then they went back and said, well, we don't mean that, and we will continue with the current system. So there was no clear stance from their end, and that was something that was that put the Afghan people in a state of bother about their future. Right now, the Taliban have been looking forward to taking a whole of the pie, as earlier was said, that they wanted to claim a victory against the American establishment of their regime of the late 90s back. However, they also understand the ground realities that Afghanistan has progressed over the last 2 decades significantly, and it might be difficult to go back to that hardcore Taliban system. But of course, they were looking forward to taking over the whole government and coming as a lead entity, as a group leading the country, whereas the Afghan government has been pushing for elections and offering that participation and integration in the national political system.
Okay.
So not a...
I see your point. Let me go to Mr. Hakimi. Now, if you look at the latest developments on the ground, I mean, the Taliban controls something like 50% of the territory in Afghanistan. They can launch attacks at the very heart of Kabul. I mean, it's clear indication that the Americans do understand that for them to move forward in the future, they need to have the Taliban on board as a key player to ensure stability.
I think I would caution as a researcher about those statistics they just read.
They were shared by...
You can't just look at the
They were shared by many organizations, including the United Nations.
I don't doubt what you just said, the authenticity of it, but the way to interpret that perhaps is important to look at it whether the Taliban really control, do they disrupt? And I'm not in any way in favor, or my statement is not in favor of the government or the Taliban. I'm just giving you an analytical view on this. Afghanistan has population centers, they have urban centers, they have districts. In terms of clear-cut districts, I think you have about under 60 districts that are clearly under the control of the Taliban. Over 200 of those districts are under the control of the government, and the remainder is a contested area. But also, there is a population center argument. So when you look at these districts and the geography of the country, there is a distribution of population. So the majority of the country's population live in areas which are claimed by the Afghan government to be under their rule. But it's absolutely true. The insecurity is extremely, extremely disheartening. I mean, even for all of us when we go to Kabul, for Afghans themselves, when they travel out of the capital city, certain times of the day and the evening, it's difficult to go out of the precincts of the city. It's just a lot of insecurity. So there's, of course, this disruption, there's kind of stalemate, which was mentioned by Mushtaq earlier. But I think it certainly doesn't mean that the Taliban have demonstrated that they can hold cities and they can hold territory. That's a completely different debate that we haven't experienced
I see
yet.
your point.
The big cities, the big service provision, and all of these things are still done with the direct support of the international donors and delivered, either well or badly by the Afghan government. So the Taliban, as far as they're concerned, have not demonstrated a record of governing in the last several years, except for being an extremely effective insurgency group that they can disrupt, they can mobilize attacks in the heart of the cities across Afghanistan, including in Kabul, at absolutely miraculous amounts of time that they've done it.
Mr. Walsh, what is the most likely scenario after the deal? A power-sharing agreement between the government of Ashraf Ghani along with the leadership of the Taliban, or do you see the Taliban having, in a way or another, the upper hand?
Well, I think that the problem is that no side is likely to win a military victory, really, at any point. And so the whole premise of why a peace agreement is so important is that you could plausibly get to a scenario where no party gets all of the pie, but all of them get enough of the pie to feel like it's a reasonable deal and a better alternative than just fighting indefinitely. And it has been fighting indefinitely so far. So I think I worked on this as a diplomat for many years. I've experienced some other very difficult moments where there was a near miss and then something like this happened to upend the talks. The next days are really, really crucial. And there's a limited window to save what in the big picture is a huge moment of opportunity that I don't think has come before, where the whole world is focused on this peace process. all of the relevant countries, I think, are supportive of this peace process working out. The parties were ready to talk to each other and to at least explore some kind of reasonable way forward that I don't think would have to overhaul the current system. So the next few days are truly crucial to keep this becoming a larger breakdown.
Mushtaq, what happens next if the talks collapse?
Okay, first of all, I would like to just say that I echo Mr. Hakimi's position on the percentages that you mentioned. Secondly, on the future course of action, there is no way out but negotiated settlement. The military conquest is almost impossible for all sides. The talks should not, and I believe would not, collapse. The only thing is that the time frame that was envisaged for sealing a deal will lapse further. We will have more rounds of negotiations, but definitely negotiation have to continue. Otherwise, the violence will reach to a level which might not be able, no side will be able to contain or control.
Fair enough.
So the only way out is the negotiated settlement.
I'll have to go to Mr. Hakimi. Mr. Hakimi, sometimes we just tend to think about the Americans with huge leverage in Afghanistan, but there are other countries with huge interest. The Iranians, the Russians, the Pakistanis, the Indians, regional players in this part of the world, the Qataris, the Saudis, the Emiratis. How does that all geopolitical dynamic play out?
I mean, it has obviously a very important and significant role because of the geographical location of Afghanistan, because of how the Afghan government, at least in the last decade or so, has been reconnected to some extent to the new realities in the region. Those players, all of these countries, they have a lot of leverage in the country. They have their particular clientele relationship with segments of the elites in Afghanistan, and certain segments of the territory could be more vulnerable to their influences directly as well. So there are parts of the country that has border with Pakistan, huge significant parts of the country, then also parts of it with Iran, and all of those realities are important. But in no way I would say that any of those relationships with Afghanistan or with the war in Afghanistan is as significant as the role of the United States, because the United States, let's not forget, is the biggest donor of the Afghan government. It has been, it remains so. It has been the biggest donor to the military expenditure, and it has been at the forefront of supporting the Afghan security forces fighting the Taliban with the drone operations and all of this. So of course, all of these regional equilibriums are important, but the Americans' central role remains. And if I can just make a very quick point on you earlier. If I can make a quick
very briefly, please.
Sure.
Very briefly, please. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that with regards to what happens the day after the peace deal, with all due respect, I think nobody really knows. Even the Taliban have not had the opportunity to I think about this. And the Afghan elites certainly don't know what happens the following day. And because we don't know what happens after the deal is signed, this deal with the United States and between the United States and the Taliban, or even the final agreement, there is not a lot of anticipation about the clarity of how Afghanistan would look like the day after a peace deal, and hence you have all this hesitation and all kinds of uncertainties on the ground.
Johnny, less than a minute, please, if you don't mind. Until before the tweets, those talks were not really topping the agenda in the news media. Now, let's assume that Trump manages to bring them back together, the Taliban and Ashraf Ghani, and finalizes a deal. How significant for him this is going to be?
I mean, that would be very significant. A big part of President Trump's political argument is that he's good at making deals. Deals in Afghanistan and elsewhere are often very difficult. And so if he were to help accomplish a breakthrough like that, it would be hugely significant. I'd also just add quickly to Mr. Hakimi's points that right now, all of those conflicted regional states are quite aligned behind wanting this process to work. And that is rare given the diversity of interest. If this process breaks down more largely, I don't think that unity will continue. I suspect all three of us would agree on that. And the international actors, Russia, China, Pakistan, the US, will all have incentives to back different factions, to back different parts of the Afghan war. And that can't lead anywhere good. So it further illustrates the need to make this diplomatic push work, because right now, all the political incentives are aligned behind it. And to lose this moment would really be a tragedy.
Well, it's very interesting to see how this is going to further unfold. But until then, I really appreciate your time and contribution, Johnny Walsh, Hamid Hakimi, and Mushtaq Rahim. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem Ahelbarra, and the whole team here in Doha. Bye for now.